Amidst the Storm, Chapter 1, Part 2. New Home, New Faces. Time. A construct. A unit of measurement between sunup and sundown. A way to identify the exact placement of the sun and moon in the sky. A broken clock is always right twice a day. High noon and midnight. Opposites. And yet, in a strange way, the exact same thing. None of it made a difference to Shadow. Since, with the hour as late as it was, everyone on the island was asleep. Or at least, they were supposed to be. Shadow was still sitting on the beach, watching the waves as the stars glittered brightly overhead. She'd moved from her starting point earlier that day, having walked a full mile west and turning back east and returning to her starting point beyond the penthouse, the largest communal building on the island. Almost everyone on the island had been to the penthouse at least once or twice, including Shadow, who had become a regular there amongst the crowds that often packed its walls. But Shadow's eyes were not on the penthouse. They were on the storm, which had picked up a little over the past few hours or so, but which had not approached the island any closer than it had always been. Shadow's vigilance, despite the price her body so dearly paid, was the key to keeping the storm at bay. Or at least that's what she'd been telling herself for as far back as she could remember. Her eyes were on the stars in the night sky, though, with the combination of the sound of the waves breaking and the noticeable dark bags under her eyes, she was finding it hard to keep her eyes open. The only things keeping her awake at this point were the briny smell of the sea and the sound of Firesnapper playing nearby with another dragon, Stormpaw. The moon high above glowed down upon her dark red hair and her eyes, one of which was blue and the other hazel, and the deep red scales of the armor chestplate she was wearing. Quite lost in the noise of the waves and her subconscious tracing of the stars, she almost didn't hear the sound of footfalls in the sand behind her, and only just managed to pull herself into a seated position as the footsteps came closer. It was at the same time that she remembered the feathers haphazardly strewn about the sand all around her. But at this point it was too late. The footsteps came to a stop alongside her and the figure came into view. Short brown hair, sharp brown eyes, and a stature just a few inches taller than she. It could only be one, Samuel Croman, one of the few people who had arrived on the island not long after the king had left. Shadow was about to greet him, but Samuel beat her to it.
Do me a favor. Don't ask how I knew you'd be out here, if you weren't going to be asleep where you should be. Do you realize how predictable you are? Surprise me someday, won't you? Give me something to work with.
He said dryly. Good evening to you too, Samuel. Shadow replied slowly, rolling her eyes in spite of herself and Samuel's evident concern. She was hoping he wouldn't see the bags under her eyes, not that she could hide them. She heard Samuel sigh as he crossed his arms.
Look, it's obvious I can't seem to convince you to get some sleep. So, and since that's the case, I have a message to deliver. People are asking about you. They haven't seen you. They're worried.
Shadow blinked, but still didn't turn to look at Samuel. They're entitled to their concerns, Samuel. I'm all right, though, I promise. Samuel watched her sit up, but made no attempt to help. She would make it obvious if it were needed.
You've been out here all day. If you really do plan on staying put, then I can get a pillow and a blanket for you. At this point, I don't know what else I can do.
Shadow smiled. You've always looked out for me, Samuel. I appreciate it, but like I said, I'm fine. I have Firesnapper. That she did, even though Firesnapper was still playing with Stormpaw a few yards away. In the distance, the moonlight glittered off something drifting in the water, but neither Shadow nor Samuel saw it.
When was the last time you ate? I can bring you something from the penthouse. Not like Chester'll notice. He owes me a favor anyway.
But Shadow shook her head and looked back out to sea. Something was out there, and she knew it. She just couldn't see what it was. She'd felt something pulling at her earlier, compelling her to stand watch on the beach just a little longer. That was what it always was, just a little longer, just a few more minutes to appease whatever ache she was feeling, to stand guard on that pristine white beach at the edge of the world. It was an itch she would never be able to scratch, but, to her credit, she was okay with that. It was a good itch. She liked it. She and Samuel watched the waves together for a time, silent in one another's company, other than the waves washing on the sand a few feet away. Eventually, of her own accord, Shadow spoke again. The waves got stronger earlier, you know? That means that something's out there. I don't know where. I can't see it, but I can feel it. I know it's there.
How long do you plan to wait then, Shadow? A few nights ago, you stood out here on this same spot until sunup.
Shadow turned her head to look Samuel in the eyes, as if testing or judging him, and only then realized he could finally see the bags under her eyes.
And the eye bags are back. I knew they'd come back someday.
Samuel clarified, out loud to himself.
For king's sake, Princess, it doesn't even feel like you're trying anymore. Predictability, thy name is Shadow.
He sounded like a disappointed parent. Why did Shadow feel a hint of regret and shame from hearing his words? Samuel stared back at her, clearly not pleased by Shadow's lack of proper rest over the last few days. Shadow found herself worrying about the feathers scattered around the beach, but Sam's eyes weren't giving her the answers she hoped for in that regard. Finally, though, he spoke again, this time turning to look out at the waves.
How long do you plan on waiting?
To which Shadow eventually replied, As long as I need to. Despite its curtness, Shadow's answer seemed to satiate Samuel for the time being. As he fell silent alongside Shadow, his dragon, a tiny four-legged thing called Stinger, crawled up his leg and perched on his shoulder to enjoy his master's company. Shadow's eyes were still glued to the sea. The moonlight on the shifting waves finally caught the object, but Shadow and Samuel didn't see it. But Firesnapper, who came over along with Stormpaw, did see it, and lifted instantly into the air. Shadow pulled herself to her feet, knowing when something was amiss, and had come to trust Firesnapper's instincts, sometimes more than her own. Faintly then, she caught sight of the thing Firesnapper had seen, and praised the power of the king, that her sense of purpose that night had finally found the answer it was looking for. She looked briefly at Samuel. Go. Find Taylor. If she asks, Shadow sent for her. Samuel took off instantly up the embankment, Stinger sailing through the air behind him. Stormpaw watched as Shadow cupped her hands around her mouth, shouting an order to Firesnapper as he flew erratically above the waves. He was closer now than he had been, so obviously the object was moving. Firesnapper! Find! Followed by a cloud of fire dropping into the waves around a small human-shaped figure drifting on the waves towards the beach. Find! She yelled again, followed by another stream of fiery soot from Firesnapper's mouth. The last time someone had washed up onto the beach was 9 days ago, a young girl named Tegan, who Shadow hadn't seen around the island since then. Find! Shadow yelled again, hearing the faint running steps and flapping wings behind her. Taylor's voice called out to her as she came up alongside.
I'm here, Princess. What is it?
Shadow pointed to the water, and Taylor didn't waste a second. She approached the water's edge, waded in, and grabbed the body, proceeding to pull it up the sand away from the waves. Strangely, only a moment after being grabbed onto, the figure sprang to life, as if they hadn't died at all. Nonetheless, Shadow and Samuel watched as Taylor dropped the body onto the sand, got down on her knees, and pushed her hands quickly into the figure's chest. He reacted strongly, with Taylor apologizing as Shadow and Samuel made their way over. Shadow wasn't surprised at the state, since every newcomer she'd met was in a relatively good state when she'd met them. Potentially, this one wouldn't be any different.
I'm awake, thanks for asking,
said the figure, indignantly, to Taylor. He crossed his arms, appearing rather displeased at almost having his ribs potentially shattered by blunt force.
I said I was sorry.
Taylor replied profusely. Shadow side-eyed Sam. Good to see he's awake and a hold of himself. Should make our job a little easier. Sam nodded, smiled, and looked down at the figure, which he and Shadow quickly sized up. Their hair, Shadow noticed, other than being soaked through, was short, scruffy, and blonde. Their clothes, also soaked through, would have been either discarded or washed, and their eyes, staring at Taylor with great annoyance at almost being maimed, were a noticeable hazel sheen. Shadow guessed the figure to be less than 24, but still older than 18. He couldn't be much taller than 5.5 feet, even with the shoes he was wearing. Those would have to go. Shadow got down on her knees to get a closer look, followed by Samuel, who joked.
Now, Taylor. Did you apologize? You almost broke our friend's ribs.
I'll say.
Replied the boy, fresh with irritation. Taylor rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, but didn't openly acknowledge Samuel's joking rebuttal at her honest attempt to help, having forgotten that bodies were often aware of themselves when they arrived.
It was just chest compressions.
Shadow ignored Taylor for the moment and looked back at the figure lying on the sand in front of her. Stinger sat at the figure's feet, watching curiously. Was it friend, or was it food? I suppose we've cleared up whether you're coherent or not, then, Shadow said with a smile.
I am now, yeah. I don't mean to be rude, but it certainly isn't thanks to your friend here. She almost shouted my ribs. Didn't even bother to get my name first.
He muttered, eyeing Taylor again for a moment. At her expense, Samuel replied.
You'll have to forgive her, friend. She can be a bit forward sometimes. Date first, ask questions later, you know? Ain't that right, Taylor?
Oh, go pound some sand.
Taylor muttered in reply. Sam just smiled and was relieved to see that the figure was too, at least for a moment. At this, though, he let Shadow take the reins. I suppose, since you've met Taylor, it's about time you met the rest of us. My name is Shadow, Evening Sun. You've washed up on my island, my home. The young man looked around briefly.
You washed up from the sea just now. Either that or you're a really strong swimmer, if you couldn't tell. From that storm out there. The name's Samuel, by the way.
Samuel nudged his head in the direction of the storm, though it became evident the boy knew this already. Taylor spoke up.
If it means anything, there's nothing broken that I can see.
To which James replied,
Just you wait a second. There's about to be plenty of things broken if you try to crush me again.
I said I was sorry.
Anyway, with that out of the way, why don't you tell us about yourself? What's your name? Where did you come from? At this, the newcomer was quiet, and finally seemed to settle down. He eased himself against the sand, letting his muscles relax as he did. He started looking around again, making no attempt to sit up, but still appeared to be trying to figure out where he was and how he'd ended up there. Was it an uninhabited stretch of Rockhopper Island? Possibly. Plenty of ships could get stranded like that during a bad storm. He'd heard of it happening before. He eyed Shadow after a moment, extending a hand, which Shadow took.
My name's James. James Johnson. Pleasure to meet you. Is this Rockhopper Island by chance?
Shadow had never heard of it before, but assumed James was talking about a place near his home. She shook her head in earnest. It's not, I'm afraid. I've never heard of it before. This island doesn't really have a name. She fell silent, offering James a chance to answer the questions Shadow had asked him.
I was trapped in a storm with some friends of mine on a boat. A big storm. We were in Bar Harbor, Maine, when the storm came. It pulled us out to sea.
A brief pause, then...
And the next thing I know, we were picked up by a wave and we got thrown into the sea. I blacked out after that, and I guess I'm here now.
Shadow could see the lingering expectation in his eyes. He looked over at Samuel, who watched and waited patiently.
You haven't seen any of them, have you? Are they here?
Samuel's only question was...
Who exactly are you looking for?
James paused, just barely able to recollect their names. He must have been hit pretty hard if his memory was acting so fuzzy.
Captain Grant, and my friends, Lily, Matthew, and Andrew. They were the ones on the ship with me.
He watched Taylor, Shadow, and Samuel share a long, uncertain, and difficult look. It didn't take long for Taylor to answer James' inquiry.
I'm afraid we haven't seen anyone else, James. You're the first one to come ashore for a few days now.
Samuel added.
There are some others on the island with those names, but I doubt they're the ones you're looking for.
Can you check, please?
But Shadow was quick to intervene. Is there anything else you can remember, James? Anything at all? But try as he might to recollect anything else about the sinking or of anything else related that day at all, he couldn't bring anything back. He shook his head and allowed his body to relax.
You think you can sit up?
Samuel asked as he took a step closer to James, reaching out an arm. Without answering, James grabbed hold and was slow to pull himself up, fighting a headache as he did, which threatened to pull him back into unconsciousness a second time. He fought it off, shutting his eyes to recover and taking long, slow breaths to refill his lungs. He finally, albeit slowly, recalled something from before he'd blacked out.
I prayed.
He said slowly, as if to try and prove something, though he wasn't sure what.
I prayed the Lord's Prayer before I hit the water and the ship went down. I figured maybe if I at least tried...
But he trailed off there. Shadow knew what he was thinking, though. She had met so many who had expressed their attempts at prayer in the hopes of avoiding disaster, if only by just a moment or two. So many had tried, and so many had failed, and yet here, on the island, they lived. As if their trials of faith and their last moments of life had been worth nothing. James, it was now apparent, was no different. Shadow tried to give him some comfort, but could only hope that it would suffice. Well, prayer works in mysterious ways, James. It doesn't often give us the result we hope for, but sometimes the result we do get might just be a little better than the result we wanted. James' initial expression offered more uncertainty than she'd hoped for, so she offered a little more in the hopes it would help. Take the storm you and your friends went through, for example. She started. You just mentioned that you prayed, maybe hoping the storm would stop there and let you and your friends get home safe. Well, maybe it was a better end to have arrived here than to go back home. You asked for mercy, but were spared instead. James cocked an eyebrow and replied,
I don't really follow. And besides, you say it's better that I'm here instead of back home. How?
Well, if the storm is really as bad as you say it was, and I'm not discounting your experience at all, it sounds terrible. Painful, even. She paused for a moment before saying, with a storm that bad, what would the odds be that you and your friends would have anything or anyone to return home to in the first place? Any chance James might have had to respond stopped there. More of his memory was slowly coming back, and he could remember the ferocity of the storm he'd been through with his shipmates. He could hear the crashing of the waves in his ears, the screams and shouts of his friends, and the sound of the ship as it cracked into and plunged into the abyss. He hadn't seen anyone in his last moments, only the dark shape of the Merlin as it dropped like a stone into the black. Slowly, as more realization dawned on him, he seemed to succumb to his thoughts and fell silent. He simply stared up into the sky, looking at the stars as they glittered brightly overhead. Shadow, Samuel, and Taylor all watched, but he just sat there. Shadow could almost see the resolution forming in his eyes, a feeling she knew better than any, thanks in no small part to how many souls she had welcomed to this lonely little island out at sea.
So that's it then. I'm dead. I'm dead and none of my friends are here. This is it?
Shadow nodded. This is it, James, was all she could say in reply. It never got any easier. James's eyes drifted again, this time back to the beach, where he looked upon Firesnapper, Stormpaw, and Stinger for the first time.
Dragons?
He asked. Samuel smiled and held out his hand, onto which Stinger hopped from his shoulder, standing proud for James to see. He was a small dragon, about the size of a squirrel, with a long, slender tail and a square snout. His body was covered over in dark blue scales, with short spines down his back that glowed an almost neon shade of electric blue. Firesnapper was a large dragon, though sitting down James couldn't tell just how large, with scales of bright orange, red, yellow, and amber. He seemed placid enough.
Yours?
James asked, pointing between Shadow and the dragon sitting next to her. Shadow nodded. This is Firesnapper, and yes, he's mine. He's friendly though, so no need to be afraid. As if to say hello, Firesnapper made his way slowly over alongside James, his feet stamping firmly in the sand as he moved. Samuel indicated Stinger.
Stinger's also friendly, once you get to know him, anyway. He's a bit skittish, though, so don't go scaring him. Unless you're fond of electroshock therapy, that is.
Noted.
James replied as Firesnapper nudged his head under James's left arm, as if asking for attention. James complied rather curiously, beholding the purring and chittering noises from the massive dragon. Stormpaw remained where she was.
Stormpaw's mine, if you couldn't tell.
Taylor indicated in appearance. Stormpaw looked as though they had been showered in multiple dark blue colors of paint, save for the feet, all of which were black. James nodded, continuing to offer affection to Firesnapper, and yet all the while there was still a lingering look in his eyes. Shadow was watching, not surprised that it didn't change. There was a longing there, a confusion, and yet a sort of fearful understanding that this place and these people were it. They were the new life he'd been given. This was the new home where he belonged. This was the end of his old life, and yet the beginning of something new. Shadow's eyes kept watch over James as the group remained sat on the sand. But before long, James finally made a slow attempt to stand. He propped himself against Firesnapper, who didn't mind, before looking once more around the group.
So, where exactly do we go from here? What's next?
Shadow looked towards the penthouse up the embankment before replying. It's gonna take some time to make sure we have a place ready for you. For now, you're welcome to stay in one of the rooms in the penthouse. It's the large building up the embankment there.
What about my clothes?
James asked, looking at himself for a moment. We can send those into town and have them cleaned. I can arrange for more to be sent to you so you don't have just the one outfit. James seemed to accept this and finally looked ready to join his hosts on the island. He turned with them as they headed up the beach, aiming for the penthouse. One last thing seemed to spark James's interest, though, which he was quick to inquire about as the group walked up the beach.
So, you say this is it? Pardon me for saying so, but if this is heaven, it looks different than the way the Bible describes it. Can I ask what's up with that?
Shadow looked over her shoulder at James. She looked to be thinking quite hard about how to properly answer this question. He could see that thoughtfulness in her eyes. It was a harder question to answer than she thought, but she was going to try her best. Do you always ask tough questions, James? She teased curiously. She went back to thinking and said, Honestly, that's kind of a hard question. I've lived on this island all my life, so I haven't really known anything else. The king built this place here because... She paused for a moment or two. I suppose it was just because the island was here. It was the best place for it. I can't speak for the king, honestly. I worry I might say something wrong. James was being flooded with answers, but it seemed that the questions he wanted to ask were adding up a lot faster. He would need more time to get up to speed, but if it was true that this place was heaven and he was dead, then he had all the time he could ever hope for.
You could try, though, couldn't you?
He asked curiously. Their feet left the sand, pressing into firm soil and grass. They weren't that much farther from the penthouse now. The thrumming of the music was getting louder, as were the murmurs of voices underneath it. Stinger, Stormpaw, and Firesnapper never left their master's sides, however, as if entering a public building like this had become commonplace. I'd rather not, just in case. The king is a powerful man, not to be disrespected. He has eyes and ears everywhere, even where you can't see or hear anything. James' expression showed his newfound concern.
He doesn't sound like a good king, if that's the case,
He said, followed by,
I would hold my tongue from making assumptions like that if I were you.
Samuel replied assertively. James looked in his direction, but couldn't speak before Samuel did. His tone was firm.
The king is a good man. The best one you'll ever know of, in fact. He's the king, if that makes more sense. Your Bibles have a lot more to say about that. I don't know just how religious you are, but you do right by not questioning his authority. That's a fast track down to the basement, my friend, and the stairs aren't covered in carpets.
James thought of something at that exact moment.
I asked you if this was it earlier, right?
He eyed Shadow with this question, but she could sense what was coming from a mile away. She could sense it almost as clearly as she could smell the sea behind them.
And you said yes. You told me without a shadow of a doubt that this was it.
He only paused for a second before continuing.
And if this was it, then you would only be able to tell me the truth. But that doesn't sound like the truth to me.
I would shape up and shut my mouth if I were you, James. That ice is looking real thin right about now.
And since you obviously weren't telling me the truth, then this isn't it.
Shadow was quiet. Her expression was fearfully unreadable. Taylor could see it, and it made her uncomfortable. Shadow wasn't to be disrespected or argued with, especially being the daughter of the king, the man who had left her in charge of the island and all the people on it. Shadow had the most authority of anyone here and the most power. She could silence anyone here just thinking about it, and Taylor wasn't surprised if such was about to be the case. James spoke again, still with a harsh tone in his voice, but Shadow was unmoved. She was as fast to the ground as a boulder to a mountainside. She wouldn't be challenged like this, and she knew it.
And if this isn't it, then I want to know what is. If everything here is yours, and if you're so powerful, then do me a favor.
Shadow's tone was as cold as the Antarctic wind. Shall I wash your feet, then? Like my father did for his advisors in their own shock and offense.
You can do me one better than that, princess.
James droned snakily. Samuel flinched hard.
If this isn't it, and it isn't heaven, then with all your royal power, show me what is.
Silence. Pure, unadulterated silence. Are you daring me, James, son of Joseph? The voice could have cut stone.
And so what if I am?
He registered the pain before the sight of what happened. He would have hit the ground if he hadn't bumped into Firesnapper on the way. Firesnapper nudged him back, more out of discomfort than anything. Suddenly, no one was sympathetic to him anymore. He stood, and Shadow's face came within an inch of his own. A cold feeling went down his back. But he was here. If he backed away now... Suddenly, doing so actually sounded appealing. He tried, but couldn't move. Then be grateful that in your last moment the king spared you in that storm. If he hadn't, then you wouldn't be here. May the king strike me down for this, but maybe if he hadn't spared you, you might be back with your friends again. Would that make you happy? Silence for a moment. You order me to prove to you the truth as if I'm some sort of servant girl, as if I'm that Philippian slave girl used by her owners for their own greed. Well, I tell you this, James, son of Joseph, you won't get any visions or tellings from me except this one. She grabbed hold of his collar, pulling it through the fingers of her metal-clad hand. You think you are deserving of my father's kingdom, of his riches, his halls, his wisdom, his power. But I tell you this, for as far as the east is from the west, you are unworthy of everything my father and his kingdom have to offer. For as long as you wish for his provision, until you prove yourself, you deserve nothing. My father hears you, James. He sees you, every last part of you. You do not know the shame he feels on your behalf. I do not wish I knew. That cold feeling down James's back was getting worse. It wasn't hindsight. It was the realization of the truth. And yet, it was also his denial of the truth. It was burning away like a wildfire. If you wake up in hell tomorrow, the king will understand why we did not feel sorry for you. Silence once again, and this time it stayed. That cold, unbending, unshattered look of victory in Shadow's eyes never disappeared. She didn't look away. She looked at James. She looked into him as far and as deep as she could. When James could bear the pressure no longer, he flinched, cowered, and looked away. But Shadow wasn't done. She pulled him again, keeping their faces close together. James was shaking, all but desperate to be free. Not just yet. He needed to hear this. You stand here asking all these questions of me as if I'm some accused on the stand being questioned for a crime I did not commit. Well, your time for questions is over. I ask you this. Do you still wish to know the truth? Do you wish to go the way of Sodom and Gomorrah? Do you wish to know the truth as Lot's wife once did? Do you wish to see the king as Moses did? Then look me in the eyes, James, son of Joseph, and tell me exactly what you see. A flashbang went off instantly, burning James's eyes to their core and forcing him back. If he had still been alive, then he wasn't anymore. Any normal man certainly wouldn't have survived an impact like that. So when James realized he was still alive, he was stunned. Fearfully so. Was he still alive? Was he finally dead? Was it over? He couldn't tell. Was it from the light or the ringing in his ears? He righted himself unsteadily, slipping more than once before he looked back, betrayed by the look on his face and the sound of his voice.
Don't look at me like that! You're not a princess, you're a freak! What did I just see?
You take that back, you faithless pig.
Samuel snapped. Shadow's hand went up, and she pushed herself into James's face once more. This would be the last they saw of each other tonight.
If you wish to apologize, then do not think you will gain mercy from me. You will apologize to the king, and you will mean it, and will bear whatever weight he puts upon you. I am not the one you apologize to.
She stepped away, making a motion for Samuel to follow her, and he did as Taylor walked ahead. James almost hit the ground a second time, nudged in the back by Firesnapper, who snorted angrily behind him. Obviously, he shared in the emotions shown by Shadow. James walked ahead by choice, heading for the doors to the penthouse, while Shadow and Samuel stopped a few feet off to the side. She was direct in her voice, dropping the coldness and weight of authority she'd just been holding. It was a visible weight lifted away. She didn't like being stern and overbearing like this. She wanted to keep the peace. But some people were just harder to work with than others. James, it seemed, wouldn't be easy to work with either, though hopefully that wouldn't last. See to it that James has a room ready in the penthouse for the next few nights. I'll set the others to getting a home ready for him in town. Make sure he has food, water, clothes, and whatever else he should need.
Not as though he deserves much at this point, if you don't mind my saying so, Princess.
Samuel answered bravely. Shadow couldn't blame him for feeling this way. Samuel took as much from people like James as she did. He was a good, honest man, raised well by his own family before coming to the island. He'd known his place when he arrived. He hadn't questioned anything. Shadow had seen how much he'd improved since then. I can't condemn you, Samuel. That's the king's job, she said. Samuel nodded.
Then I'm sure I'll get my judgment in time. Pray I still wake up here on the island tomorrow, I suppose.
Just a moment or two of pause between them passed.
I'll see to his provisions right away. Is there anything else I can do?
Shadow shook her head. No, thank you. Not exactly sure where I'm going after this, but somewhere. Samuel smiled and looked back down at the beach, still swamped with waves.
Don't you dare go back to that beach. I'll be doing my own rounds tonight. I'll keep a lookout for you, and if I find you down there, then I will not hesitate to drag you back to your bed myself,
he said, holding back a chuckle. If you must insist, then I suppose I'll go somewhere else for the night. Thank you, Samuel, she said, feeling more of the weight from earlier disappearing. She expected Samuel to step away to carry out his orders, but for a moment or two he stayed where he was. He looked in the direction of the doors, settled, looked into the star-covered sky, then back down to earth again. There was something in his eyes. Feeling curiosity looming like a shadow, the princess poked at her friend, wondering what he might be thinking. There's something in your eyes, Sam, she analyzed. Sam nodded after a moment, but didn't speak. What is it? Entertain me if you aren't going to carry out your orders just yet. The 25-year-old settled more comfortably on his feet, feeling Singer perch onto his shoulder again, before he said,
I'm just thinking is all. Got to it after James walked inside.
The way Shadow leaned gave voice to her silent curiosity, which Samuel could no longer ignore. He felt a smile creep onto his lips. He didn't realize how infectious it had already become.
Back when the king atomized Sodom and Gomorrah, you know? Everyone died. Even Lot's wife. If only because she looked back when the angels told her not to. She had it coming. But, looking at James back there, it makes me wonder.
Shadow couldn't hold the smile back, but said nothing.
Are we absolutely positive that the king killed everyone? I mean, rats are survivalists, so...
Shadow just started laughing, as surprised as she was at the sound of herself. Samuel stood by, huffing and muttering to himself playfully, to keep the mood up, and it worked until Shadow had finally composed herself enough to ask. What on this island am I going to do with you, Samuel? You were too good for that world, and I'm starting to think you're too good for this one. Samuel just shrugged, holding his smile and replying,
Whatever the king wishes to be done with me. When he comes back, that is. Until then, princess, I'm not sure. Whatever you choose to be done with me.
Shadow smiled. I think I'll just have to keep you around for a bit longer, then, she said, as if relenting to a choice that had no other option. Samuel followed this up with a look of authority of his own. Shadow paid attention to it.
Then so be it. And if I may be so bold, since you have issued me an order, I feel it only right to issue an order of my own to you.
Shadow cocked a curious eyebrow. And what might that be, Samuel? She pondered. He stood a bit taller now and looked firmer.
Get away from that beach. Go home and get some sleep.
Shadow smiled, rolled her eyes, and said, All right, Dad. Surprisingly, Samuel looked quite proud of himself. It wasn't often that anyone issued orders to the princess, the head of the island. It seemed nowadays that this right had been reserved solely for Samuel, though none of the other islanders could prove it. And, if it were true, then it certainly wasn't obvious. A few silent moments later, he finally stepped away, gave a small salute, and headed for the doors of the penthouse. Finally alone, Shadow let out a long, tired sigh and shook her head, letting sink in the reality of the past few minutes. Taking a moment or two to herself, then she turned toward the wall and got down on her knees. Breathing slowly, she shut her eyes and lowered her head. Forgive him, Father, for he doesn't know the truth of his actions or words. Bring wisdom and correctness to him, your wisdom, your correctness. Bring him the understanding he needs, not that which he desires. If it is your will, if it is your way, then do what you feel is right. Spare his soul and give him rest. Don't leave this cup with me, for it is too full for me to drink alone. Take this burden from me, help me, guide me. Please, Father. And after staying on her knees for just a minute more, she stood, said one last prayer, then disappeared into the night. She needed to think, to be alone with her thoughts and prayers. There was one place on this island where she knew she could go without being disturbed, far enough away from everything else that she knew it was safe. She didn't tell anyone where she was going or when she would be back. Only Firesnapper followed after her.